Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The stench of sulfur filled Carl's nostrils as he staggered through the endless corridors of Hell Prison. His body, bent and broken from years of torment, barely responded to his will anymore. Once a proud knight, clad in shining armor and filled with righteous purpose, now he was nothing more than a shell of a mana damned, tortured, and imprisoned in the depths of hell. The prison was unlike anything from the mortal world. It was a labyrinth of horrors, where the bones of the damned made up the very walls, and the screams of those eternally punished echoed without end. The floors burned, sizzling the flesh of the souls that stumbled across them, and the sky above, if one could even call it that, was a swirling mass of darkness and fire. Carl had learned early on that time had no meaning here. Days bled into nights, and nights into eternity. But even in the hellish monotony, there was something worse than the physical agony. It was the guilt. It gnawed at Carl's soul, a constant reminder of his fall from grace. He had been a knight, and honorable, respected, and feared. But pride had consumed him, twisting his once noble heart into something dark and selfish. His sins were many, and now, they bound him to this place for eternity. A lash of fire whipped across his back, tearing into his flesh as one of the demon guards passed by. Carl gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to scream. Showing pain gave them pleasure, and he would give them nothing. He had learned that much in his time here. The demon cackled, a guttural sound that grated against Carl's ears, before moving on to torment another wretched soul. Carl waited, watching the creature retreat into the shadows, then pressed on. He had somewhere to be, something to discover. In this place, hope was a dangerous thing, but rumors had reached him even here. There was talk of a rebellion, whispers that a group of souls was preparing to overthrow their demonic captors and escape. Carl had dismissed it at first as nothing more than desperate fantasy, the kind of false hope that kept the damned from descending completely into madness. But the whispers persisted, growing louder with each passing day, and now Carl could feel it in the air. A change was coming. He followed the twisting path deeper into the prison, his eyes scanning the shadows for signs of life. Hell's demons were always watching, lurking in every corner, waiting to crush any hint of defiance. But Carl had grown adept at avoiding their gaze, slipping past their watchful eyes like a shadow. The deeper he ventured, the darker it became, until even the flickering flames of hell itself seemed to fade. And then he saw a flicker of movement in the distance. Instinctively, Carl reached for the hilt of the sword that was no longer there. He cursed silently, forgetting for a moment that his once precious weapon had been taken from him the day he arrived. But he would fight with his bare hands if he had to. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. There, huddled in the corner of a broken archway, were two figures. One was tall, their form shrouded in a ragged cloak, while the other sat crouched low, sharpening a blade against a jagged stone. "You came," a voice rasped. It was the tall figure, their voice hoarse but laced with strength. "We didn't know if you would." Carl stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I heard the rumors. I had to see for myself." The figure stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a woman's face, sharp features, pale skin, and eyes that burned with a defiant fire. "I am Myra," she said, her voice cold yet commanding. "And this," she nodded toward the other figure, "is Darius." The man, Darius, looked up briefly, his eyes hollow and tired. He returned to sharpening the blade without a word. Carl eyed the two cautiously. "So it's true, then? There really is a rebellion?" Myra's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Rebellion? That's too kind a word for what we're planning. We're not looking to overthrow the prison, we're looking to escape. Hell's chains bind us all, but there's a way out." Carl crossed his arms, skepticism creeping into his voice. "A way out of hell? You expect me to believe that?" "You can believe whatever you want," Myra shot back. "But we've been down here long enough to know the truth. There's a portal, hidden deep within the prison, guarded by demons and sealed by ancient magic. It's the only way out." Carl felt a flicker of hope stir within him, but he quickly pushed it down. Hope was dangerous. And you think you can reach it? What's stopping the demons from tearing you apart before you even get close? Myra's eyes gleamed. That's where you come in, Carl. We need a fighter, someone who can hold his own against the demons. You're a knight, aren't you? Or you were. We've seen you fight before. Carl's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. I'm not the man I used to be. None of us are, Darius said, finally speaking up. His voice was quiet but steady, as if every word carried the weight of years. But if you want to stay here, rotting for eternity, that's your choice. We're offering you a chance to escape. A long silence settled between them. Carl looked at the two of the Myra's burning determination, Darius's quiet resolve. They were both beaten down, broken like him, yet there was a spark in them that hadn't been extinguished. Against all odds, they still believed in something. Carl took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his past sins pressing down on him. He had spent so long running from his guilt, from the man he used to be, but now, in the depths of hell, he had a choice. He could stay here, rotting away in torment, or he could fight a fight for something greater, something that might even bring him a sliver of redemption. I'm in, Carl said at last, his voice rough but resolute. Myra's smile widened. Good. We leave at dawn. The air was thick with tension as the small group of rebels gathered in the dim light of a broken alcove. Myra stood at the front, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of those who had joined her cause. There were only a handful of Carl, Darius, and a few other damned souls who had grown tired of their eternal suffering. Each one of them had been through hell literally, and it showed in their eyes. Myra addressed them in a low, urgent voice. We move fast, and we move quiet. The demons will be distracted by the ritual tonight. That's when we strike. Carl, standing at the back of the group, listened intently. He had spent the last few days training with Myra and Darius, sharpening his skills with makeshift weapons forged from the bones and molten iron that could be scavenged from the prison's depths. It wasn't the sword he had once wielded as a knight, but it would have to do. The portal is located deep in the heart of the prison, Myra continued, her voice steady. It's guarded by the warden himself, Asmodai. He's one of the oldest and most powerful demons in hell. We'll need to disable the demonic altar that powers the portal's seals before we can even think about escaping. Darius stepped forward, his quiet voice carrying weight. We have the weapons. They're forged from the blood of demons. It's the only thing that can harm them. But we'll only get one shot at this. If we fail. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what failure meant. An eternity of suffering, with no hope of redemption. Carl tightened his grip on the bone-handled weapon in his hand. His mind was clear now, focused. He wasn't the same man who had arrived in hell, broken and ashamed of his past. He had a purpose now, a reason to fight. If there was even the slightest chance of escape, he would take it. And if he died trying, at least he would die fighting. The group moved swiftly through the dark corridors of the prison, their footsteps barely making a sound. The demons that patrolled these halls were vicious, but they weren't omnipotent. The rebellion had learned to move in the shadows, slipping past the guards unnoticed. As they approached the heart of the prison, Carl felt the air grow colder, the oppressive heat of hell fading into something more sinister. The walls seemed to pulse with dark energy, and the ground beneath their feet felt like it was shifting, alive with the essence of the damned. There it is, Myra whispered, pointing ahead. Carl followed her gaze and saw the altar, a towering structure made of obsidian and bone, pulsing with an eerie red light. It was surrounded by a circle of demonic runes, and standing before it, as still as a statue, was Asmodai, the warden of Hell Prison. The sight of the demon sent a chill down Carl's spine. Asmodai was massive, his body covered in thick, blackened armor that seemed to writhe with dark magic. His eyes burned with a fiery intensity, and his hands, long and clawed, gripped a wickedly curved blade that looked capable of cleaving through anything. Myra turned to the group, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to destroy the altar. That's our only chance. Carl nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had faced death before, but never like this. Never in the face of a creature so ancient and powerful. The group moved into position, spreading out around the room. Carl kept his eyes on Asmodee, watching for any sign of movement. The demon didn't move, but Carl could feel its eyes on him, as if it were waiting, biding its time. Darius stepped forward first, raising his weapon high. With a fierce cry, he brought it down on the altar, the sound of bone and iron clashing against the dark stone echoing through the chamber. The runes flickered, and for a moment, Carl thought they might have succeeded. But Asmodee moved with terrifying speed. The warden's blade swung through the air, cutting through the dim light like a shadow. Darius barely had time to react before the blade struck him down, cleaving through his body with brutal efficiency. He fell to the ground, dead before he even hit the floor. Carl felt the world slow as Darius's body crumpled to the ground, the wet thud of his lifeless form filling the chamber with an eerie finality. The demons around them stirred, but it was Asmodee's gaze that pierced through Carl's chest like a blade. The Warden of Hell, towering and unmoving just moments before, now moved with a terrifying grace, his blade dripping with Darius's blood. The remaining rebels froze, their courage faltering. But Carl couldn't afford to let fear rule them now. This was the moment, the point where they either died as broken souls or fought to reclaim whatever humanity was left within them. With a shout that ripped from deep within him, Carl charged. His feet pounded the stone floor as he ran directly at Asmodee, weapon raised high. The demon's burning eyes locked onto him, and for a split second, time seemed to still. Then, with a sound like thunder cracking through the underworld, Carl's bone-handled sword clashed against Asmodee's dark blade. The impact sent shockwaves up his arms, nearly breaking his grip, but he held on with a grim determination, pushing against the demon's impossible strength. His heart pounded as Asmodee's cold, mocking smile curled across his twisted lips. "You believe you can escape this place, mortal?" Asmodee's voice was like molten iron, each word a burning coal in the air. "Fools! All of you are mine, bound to this prison by your sins." Carl grunted as he struggled against the demon's power, his muscles straining. "Better to die fighting than rot for eternity." Asmodee laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the chamber, and with a flick of his wrist, he flung Carl backward as if he were nothing more than a leaf in a storm. Carl slammed into the hard stone floor, his vision swimming as pain shot through his body. He struggled to his feet, shaking off the dizziness, and saw Myra charging in from the opposite side. She moved swiftly, her weapon slicing through the air toward Asmodee's exposed flank. For a moment, it seemed as though she might land a blow, but the warden was faster. He spun with inhuman speed, parrying her attack with his blackened blade and knocking her to the ground. The rebellion was grumbling. Carl's mind raced, desperation filling his chest. They couldn't overpower Asmodee, not like this. There had to be another way, some weakness they hadn't seen. He looked around, his eyes landing on the altar at the center of the room. It was still pulsing with dark energy, the demonic runes flickering like dying flames. That was Ida. The altar was the key. If they could destroy it, they might be able to weaken Asmodee, maybe even escape this wretched place. "Myra!" Carl shouted as he scrambled to his feet, running toward the altar. "The altar! We need to break it!" Myra, still recovering from Asmodee's strike, looked up at him with understanding. She nodded, quickly pushing herself to her feet, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. Without another word, the two of them sprinted toward the towering structure of obsidian and bone. Asmodee roared in fury, realizing their plan. His wings, massive and leathery, unfurled with a snap, and he surged forward, his eyes blazing with a fury that made the air around him crackle with dark energy. Carl and Myra were already upon the altar, raising their weapons high. They brought them down with all their strength, striking the runes that powered the demonic seals. The altar shuddered beneath their blows, cracks spiderwebbing across its surface. The dark energy flickered, weakening as they continued to rain blows down upon it. Asmodee's roar grew louder, more desperate. He rushed forward, but it was too late. With one final strike, Carl's weapon shattered through the center of the altar. The explosion of energy that followed knocked both him and Myra off their feet. A deafening screech filled the chamber as the altar's power imploded, the dark magic that held the prison together unraveling in an instant. Carl lay on the ground, gasping for breath as the world seemed to spin around him. He could feel the air change, the weight of the prison lifting, if only slightly. It was working, their path to escape was opening. But Asmodee wasn't done. The demon warden, now weakened but still furious, staggered forward, his blade dragging across the floor as he advanced on Carl. Blood dripped from his wounds, the dark magic that had once made him invincible now fading. But even weakened, Asmodee was a force of nature. Carl forced himself to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Myra was beside him, battered but alive. The two of them stood side by side, their weapons raised, ready to face Asmodee one last time. "You will not leave this place," Asmodee snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You belong here. This is your eternal punishment." Carl didn't reply. He simply charged. The battle was brutal. Asmodee, though weakened, still fought with the strength of 1,000 damned souls. His strikes were heavy, each one sending shock waves through Carl's bones, but Carl fought back with everything he had. Myra darted in and out of the fray, her blade flashing as she struck at Asmodee's exposed sides. But the demon was relentless, and Carl knew they couldn't last much longer. They needed to end this now. As the battle raged on, Carl saw an opening. Asmodee overextended, his blade swinging wide as he aimed for Myra. Carl seized the moment, charging forward with a roar. He drove his weapon deep into Asmodee's chest, piercing through the demon's blackened armor and into his heart. Asmodee's eyes widened in shock, his body convulsing as dark, oily blood poured from the wound. Carl twisted the blade, pushing it deeper as the demon let out a final, ear-splitting scream. The sound reverberated through the chamber, shaking the very walls of Hell Prison. Then, with a great shudder, Asmodee fell. The chamber grew still. Carl stood over the fallen warden, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His weapon was still buried in the demon's chest, the dark blood dripping onto the stone floor. It was over. Myra limped to his side, her face pale but resolute. "We did it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Carl nodded, though he could barely believe it himself. Asmodee was dead, and the altar was destroyed. The power that had bound them to this prison was broken. But they weren't free yet. "We need to get to the portal," Carl said, his voice grim. "Before the rest of the demons figure out what's happened." Myra didn't need to be told twice. Together, they stumbled through the ruins of the altar chamber, their bodies battered and bruised but their spirits unbroken. The path ahead was clear now, the dark magic that had once sealed the portal fading into nothingness. As they reached the portal, Carl hesitated. It was a swirling mass of black and red, an ominous, pulsing gateway to freedom. He had spent so long in this place, bound by guilt and shame. Could he really leave it behind? Could he truly escape his sins? Myra, sensing his hesitation, placed a hand on his arm. "We don't belong here, Carl," she said softly. "Not anymore." He looked at her, her face bruised and bloodied, but her eyes shining with hope. She was right. They had fought for this moment. They had earned it. Without another word, they stepped through the portal together. The world twisted around them, the darkness of hell fading into something bright and unfamiliar. Carl felt the weight of the prison fall away, the chains that had bound him for so long finally breaking. His body ached, but his soul felt lighter. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves in a strange new land. The sky was a deep, endless blue, and the air was cool and fresh. It was nothing like the world Carl had known, but it was free. They were free. Carl turned to Myra, who stood beside him, her eyes wide with wonder. "We made it," she breathed. Carl nodded, though his mind was already racing. They had escaped hell, but their journey was far from over. There were still souls trapped in that prison, still people suffering under the weight of their sins. "We have to go back," Carl said, his voice resolute. Myra looked at him, surprised. Go back? There are others still there, Carl said, his eyes hard. Others who deserve a chance at redemption, just like us. Myra was silent for a moment, then she nodded. You're right. We can't leave them behind. Carl felt a strange sense of peace settle over him as he looked out over the vast, open landscape before them. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he wasn't running from his past. He was moving towards something greater. Together, they turned and began walking, their steps heavy but determined. The road ahead would be long, and the battles to come even harder. But for the first time in a long time, Carl felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope.